Welcome to Lecture 5 on the Humanistic and Adlerian approaches to parent education or to parenting. You'll recall that in our previous lecture, in Lecture 4, we dealt with the behavioral approach, and today we want to cover two of the other prominent ones that you see in the parenting literature. I'll say it a little bit later, but I might as well say it now. We're only going to deal very briefly with the humanistic approach, in as much as a great deal of that and of what has been considered to be the major value of the humanistic approach has to do with the way that parents communicate with their children. So in our later lecture on parent-child communication, we will rely on them quite a bit. So I'm going to cover some of the other ideologies, beliefs, and so forth that we see in the humanistic approach so that we can contrast it both with the behavioral approach and the Adlerian approach as well. So as I've mentioned before, primarily what we're talking about in the humanistic orientation to parenting and parent education is the approach known as Parent Effectiveness Training, or PET, P-E-T, which was created by Thomas Gordon. Thomas Gordon was the student of Carl Rogers, and those of you who are therapy students are probably familiar with that name, Carl Rogers. Much of the way in which basic clinical training, as far as being able to communicate well with clients, is done, owes at least some debt to Carl Rogers. Much of what we see in marriage education, and not just parent education, in terms of how we teach people to communicate with each other, owes something to either Gordon directly or to Rogers indirectly in terms of the value of good communication. So again, we will have a whole lecture, actually 2 lectures, to think about parent-child communication. So thinking back to lecture number 4, when we were looking at the behavioral approach, we remember that the underlying metaphor, if you think of a picture of how parents might see themselves in relationship to their children, the parent is a manager, is managing behavior, is managing the stimulus environment. And so thinking carefully about, so what's the outcome you want? What are the behaviors that you would prefer? What kinds of things would be rewarding? What are appropriate punishments? All of that. You are primarily a manager of the children's behavior. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that we need to be thinking about. But again, even in as much as a lot of times when parents are coming to parenting books or parenting seminars, they're trying to deal with a problem, then the behaviorist approach can give them some things that they can change about their own behavior that will improve the situation, but secondarily also improve the relationship. It's just not that the relationship itself is the primary concern when you're using a behaviorist metaphor. As we switch from that into a humanistic way of thinking, here we begin to recognize not this, how do I manage behavior, but to look at what a child actually needs, not just how do you change what a child is doing, but what does a child as a human being need, and from a humanist perspective, from a Rogerian perspective, what a human being, any human being, and particularly a child, needs is acceptance from others. Children need to feel that they are accepted by their parents. Children need to feel that even if their behavior is not acceptable in some way, or their behavior is problematic for the parent, there is a fundamental acceptance. I accept you as a person. You are valuable to me, no matter what you do. I have had to say that to my own children on occasion when there were conflicts or misbehavior. I remember saying to my daughter many times over the course of her childhood that while we were talking about the kinds of things that I didn't want her to do, or we were talking about the trouble that she had gotten herself into, I would remind her over and over and over again, no matter what you do, I am your father, you are my daughter, and I will always love you. She needed to know that. All children need to know that from their parents, whether it's said directly or they just infer it from their parents' behavior and attitude. Children need that fundamental acceptance. Another thing that the relationship itself needs is a parent who is genuine. And this is coming directly from Carl Rogers. Genuineness means I am who I am. I let you know who I am. I do not pretend to be something that I'm not. I do not pretend to have feelings that I don't have or not to have feelings that I do have, and so on. I want to be open and honest with you, and this is what we need in a relationship. So what the emphasis on acceptance and genuineness promotes is both, on the one hand, a realism, and on the other hand, a transparency. The transparency goes along with genuineness, but the realism is a matter of saying, look, everybody, every human being, every adult, every child has parts of themselves that they worry are not going to be acceptable to others. And there may be good reason for that. Having said that, let's be realistic about the fact that all of us have problems, that all of us have a side that perhaps we wouldn't want others to see, or that we don't want to put out there as the main thing that people see about us. But if we all had that attitude, if we all recognize that there was good behavior, there was bad behavior, there are things that we like, there are things that we don't like, it might make it safer for us to be transparent, for us to be honest about the things that we would not prefer. That's not to say that anything goes, but it is to say that we recognize that all of us have things that we would not prefer to share with one another. We need safe relationships in which to be able to do that. So that's one thing that the constant communication, the consistent communication of acceptance through genuineness could promote in a relationship. Secondly, a parent who is following a humanistic perspective, who is thinking like Rogers would think, is to say, okay, so I basically think of people as being intrinsically growth-oriented. Now, they need a particular environment in which that growth can happen. My assumption is that people want to grow, that people want to be better, that people want to do what is right, and they want to do what is good, but they need a context in which people are genuine with each other and they are accepting one another. If I provide that in the parent-child relationship, then I trust that my child, being intrinsically growth-oriented, can solve her own problems. And this is why what you see when parents are really using PET or very strongly advocating a humanistic orientation, they're not trying to control the situation. They are not doing a lot of direction or giving advice or those kinds of things. They're listening. They are reflecting back to children what they're hearing. They're helping children to be able to express what it is that they really feel. They make it safe for them to think out loud. And when you do that for a child, very often, in fact, they do end up coming up with a solution for their own problem. And that's a nice thing to remember when you're a parent feeling like, oh, wait a minute, from the parent orientation, from the parent-centered orientation, it's my responsibility to fix all these things, to make these things happen. You actually have some freedom to trust that if you just are there as a genuine and accepting presence, sometimes kids will figure it out on their own and you don't have to come up with the answer. It gives you a little bit more breathing room with respect to your kids. Now, a perspective like this gives us a different way then to think about this whole matter of social reward. And remember when we were talking about the behavioral approach, and we're talking about reward versus punishment or reinforcement versus punishment, and the way that behaviorists advocate praise as the primary type of reward that they would advocate parents using in relationship to their children, that they think of that as a social reward, that praise in the context of a social relationship, of a parent and child relationship, is experienced as rewarding. Well, if you take a look at that from a humanistic point of view, you can begin to think of it in terms of, well, the relationship itself is important. We don't have to think of that as rewarding in a learning theory sense. We can think of it as rewarding in terms of this is what a relationship is meant to be. This is what a healthy relationship looks like. And you'll see something similar to that when we talk about attachment. So the emphasis, again, is on communication. Much of what you see in parent effectiveness training is built around communication, particularly, and you've probably heard this language before, the use of active listening, the use of iMessages. You may have had exposure to a parenting curriculum or a marriage workshop in which they talked about active listening, which they talked about iMessages. That language originated with Gordon. And so much of that has then passed into other curricula. And as we'll see in a bit, Thomas Gordon wasn't always happy about that. It wasn't so much a matter of saying, well, now I'm famous now for these things and everybody is using it and I'm the one that's responsible for that. What he didn't like, and this is where some of the comments that I've said previously become particularly relevant in terms of perspective, theoretical orientation, and so on, Thomas Gordon developed active listening and iMessages as an expression of a humanistic way of thinking, as a way of thinking about people, a way of thinking about relationships, a trusting way of thinking about people and kids as growth-oriented. And when his concepts got picked up and then dropped into other theoretical context, he was upset about that because he doesn't view these other approaches as actually adhering to a humanistic way of thinking. So I'll say more about that in a later lecture. So along with active listening and iMessages, you have this idea of no-lose conflict resolution, which a lot of people use also in other contexts and call brainstorming. In other words, how can we, once we've identified what each party in the negotiation needs, brainstorm a solution that will be acceptable to everybody so that there are no losers. We're looking for that win-win situation. I should probably say at this point, just to make sure that we continue to reinforce the ideas here, that in the conflict literature overall, whether we're talking about in families or whether we're talking about international negotiation or the use of conflict skills in management and so forth, people don't tend to use the language of conflict resolution anymore because that seems to suggest that it's possible that if you just use the right technique, you can make every conflict go away. And the folks that are in the conflict sphere are actually saying these days it's more realistic to talk about conflict management because conflict is inevitable. And it's better to think of it in terms of, well, what's the right approach to conflict in terms of how we can manage it in terms of the relationship, even if we're not actually able to resolve it. And as some organizational consultants would say, it isn't necessarily the case that every situation can have a win-win. That's just not realistic. But we want to be able to approach conflict in such a way that it doesn't damage the relationship or it does the least amount of damage to the relationship so that we can cooperate with each other later and have the relationship go on. So active listening, iMessages, no-lose conflict resolution. We're going to come back to all of that later in the course. But let's ask the question for the moment. What does this assume about the relationship between parents and children? Why is it that Thomas Gordon developed these ideas of active listening and iMessages and no-lose conflict resolution to begin with? Well, some of this has to do with the ways in which Gordon understands what it means for a parent to have authority. If you are, again, a parent-centered parent, if you are an authoritarian parent, if you are one who really likes to make and enforce rules, you tend to be high in control on Baumann's scale, then you probably think of authority typically in terms of power and how parents have the power to compel children, either directly or through the manipulation of the environment, rewards, punishments, and those kinds of things, to get a child to comply, to make them do what it is that you want them to do. But from a humanistic perspective, Thomas Gordon suggests there's four types, at least four types, of authority, which he calls authority E, J, C, and P, depending on which one we're talking about, what those letters actually stand for. And he wants us to think more broadly in terms of what a parent's authority consists. Authority E is the authority of expertise. In other words, I have more experience than you do in this particular area. So when it comes to making a decision, when it comes to saying this is what goes or how we should understand that, you don't have much experience in this area, I do, so I would recommend this, and my opinion is going to have more weight than yours. You see that not just in parent-child relationships, but in all other adult relationships as well. The person with the expertise usually has more say. Authority J refers to job description. In other words, because of the nature of the role that I have, it is in my purview, it's part of my job description to be the one who makes the decisions about this or to have control of this or that resource. So I am the person who has the job description of going out and earning an income and supplying the needs for the family and the money and the resources that we need. And it is not your job description as a child to do that. So part of that is I have more say in how the money is going to be spent than you do, because it's my job to make the money in the first place, and so on. So job description, sometimes by virtue of the role and what we understand the role to entail, I have authority in that way. Authority C has to do with commitments and contracts. And in some ways, this is not a personal authority. It's not vested in the person, but it's the matter of saying, if you and I have made an agreement, if you and I have signed a contract, if the family has said, well, this is the rule that we're going to follow, then we're obligated to those rules. And those commitments, those contracts have authority themselves. And really, not just the parent, but anybody in the family has the authority to invoke those commitments and contracts and say, we need to do this because this is what we decided we were going to do. So authority E, J, and C, and then authority P, power assertion. Parents are bigger, they're more powerful, and they can sometimes just use that power to get what they want and make things happen the way that they think they should happen. So now here's the question. Which of these types of authority, as far as Gordon is concerned, characterizes a legitimate use of authority? And secondly, how do children respond to the different ways of using authority? As far as Gordon is concerned, and you probably have guessed this by now, as far as Gordon is concerned, authority E, J, and C are all responsible and consistent exercises of authority from within a humanistic point of view. But authority P is not. Somebody who is following Thomas Gordon, who is following Carl Rogers, should not exercise authority by way of using your power to get your way vis-a-vis children. Now, part of the reason that Gordon would argue that is because you're really just not going to get what you want, if you think about it, really, by using power assertion. What he says is, you can make children comply, but is that really what you want? Is it just that you want compliance? Well, now there are going to be some cases in which that is the case. Your kid is about to run out into the middle of the street because they're chasing a ball or they see something they're curious about, and you definitely are going to use power to get what you want. What you want is to grab that child by the arm or by whatever and drag them back onto the sidewalk and out of the street because it's dangerous for them out there. That's not an issue of whether or not we're talking about a continuous obedience to a rule. You may need to do that several times before they learn for themselves that they can't just run out in the street. But in most other cases where physical danger is not directly involved, you have to ask yourself the question, if I do it this way, is it going to help my child to internalize why it's important to do this or to not do this? Like we said with respect to using M&Ms and uh, toilet training is for a behavior that will become self-reinforcing, so you don't have to worry about using external manipulations or techniques like that, because they will value their toilet training and continue on in the behavior and so on. If you use power-oriented techniques to get a child to do their chores, for example, and you scream and you yell at them, oh, don't be so lazy, we agreed that we're going to do this, yada, yada, yada. You can get your child to do it in most cases. Some cases not, but you can generally get your kid to do it. But that doesn't mean that they're going to grow up valuing neatness. It doesn't mean that once they leave the house, they're going to have a neat dorm room or apartment somewhere. So think about what it is that you actually want, because what Gordon says is that power assertive techniques will get you compliance, but they won't get you the kind of cooperation that you probably would really want if you were to stop and think about it for a bit. And he is quite clear in directly criticizing behavioral approaches on that score, including James Dobson. Dobson was most popular back in the 1970s, I think it was, when Dare to Discipline was first published. It was probably 1970. I think both PET and Dare to Discipline were published in the same year, if I remember correctly, which is kind of an odd coincidence, if you like, perhaps not even a coincidence. So he's quite critical of the behavioral approach. And although the Adlerian approach is not quite the same, he also views the Adlerian approach as being coercive. And we'll say more about that in just a bit. Again, we're going to keep coming back to some of these ideas in different lectures under different guises. So let's talk then about the Adlerian approach. I'm giving you a few book covers here so you can see some of the things that are out there. The STEP program, Systematic Training for Effective Parenting, is a well-known parent training program that's based on Adlerian principles. Active Parenting has been around for quite a while. It's gone through different iterations. It is now called Active Parenting Today. That's based on Adlerian principles. And Jane Nelson's Positive Discipline, which is available in different formats for different audiences as well, is also based on an Adlerian perspective. That's not to say that these perspectives don't blend in some other ideas as well, but they're primarily from that point of view. So we want to take a look at some of the basic ideas behind an Adlerian approach. So you might have guessed that the Adlerian approach is from Alfred Adler. Go figure. Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. He was a little bit younger, a fellow Austrian as well, and also a fellow therapist. Adler was, when he created his own psychology, what is now known as Adlerian psychology, obviously, was responding to Freud and Freud's idea of what our intrinsic motivation, psychic motivation, would be. Now, Adler was a sickly child, as reports would have it, and always had a little bit of a problem feeling like he fit in school and with the other children. And so in thinking about his own story and his own life, he came up with a theory. He created a theory in which feelings of inferiority are the primary motive, or at least one of the primary motives behind children's behavior. It's that sense that I don't measure up and I need to do something to compensate, because what I want is to feel bigger. What I want is to feel superior. And I think a lot of us can understand that point of view, the different kinds of things that we have in our own personality that we're not proud of, or where we feel small, or where we feel not enough. Much of the literature these days on shame, for example, tends to say that we have a culture, a modern culture that we live in now, in which people are, no matter how successful they actually seem to be on the outside, are always struggling with these feelings of inferiority. So Adlerian psychology actually makes quite a bit out of that and turns it into a way of thinking about what it is that children are trying to achieve. What children want. I mean, here we're thinking about Carl Rogers. What we want is acceptance and so forth. Well, it's similar, but a little bit sideways to that. Alfred Adler says what we want is significance. What we want is belonging. And so children's behavior and children's misbehavior are both purposeful, whether they're behaving in the way you want or not. They're still trying to find significance in some way. Now, it's harder to do in some situations, and so kids get creative, and here's where we need to begin to think of the possibility that when children are misbehaving, they are trying to find significance in some way. Well, it's a creative idea, and we'll need to take a look at that a little more closely. So children are frustrated from getting what it is that they want. They're feeling discouraged, and literally discouraged. Their courage has been taken away from them. Their heart has been taken away from them, and they are misbehaving out of that and trying to figure out how to get back, if they've ever had it, get back to a place of significance and belonging. So one of the key ideas in Adlerian approaches to parenting is to learn the 4 goals of misbehavior, that there are different things that children do to get back that sense of I belong, I'm significant, and so on. And when you learn the 4 goals of misbehavior, you may have a different perception of what your child is doing, and you can respond to it differently. The other thing is that not only do you learn the 4 goals of misbehavior, but you use approaches to parenting that are inherently democratic as opposed to autocratic. You think of these different metaphors of government here. Autocratic would be similar to what Baumrind would call authoritarian. I'm the person in charge, I'm large and in charge, I say what goes, you do what I say. Or laissez-faire, which would correspond to what Baumrind calls permissive. Parenting democratically, as some people would suggest, and even those who are writing in Adlerian psychology, the inherently democratic way to parent is the authoritative way to parent. Baumrind's idea of being both high in control, but the kind of control that uses reasoning and talks with the child to gain some kind of mutual understanding, and then also high in warmth. So, what about the 4 goals of misbehavior? So let's talk about the 4 goals of misbehavior, which are in Adlerian theory: attention-getting, struggle for power, revenge, and displaying disability or inadequacy. Remember that what a child wants is some sense of significance or some sense of belonging. That is what they are driven to. And that's true not only of behavior, but of misbehavior. Now, I got this picture off the internet. I don't remember exactly where I got it from, and there's no story that goes along with that. But when I look at that picture, I sort of make up my own story with that. I think of a kid who is given her crayons and markers, and she's bored and looking for something to do. She wanders out onto the back deck of their home with her crayons and starts coloring on the wood. Now, did she do that deliberately to be naughty? I don't know, probably not, but at the very least, this is something that her parents would not approve of, and mom or dad sees her doing that, and they march right outside, and who knows exactly how they handle it or what they say, but they probably take the crayons and the markers away, And she's basically not okay with that, very unhappy. And as the face would suggest, not just unhappy, but angry, mad that she has been thwarted from doing what it was that she was having fun doing just a minute ago. Now, children, when they do something that is considered to be misbehavior, sometimes if you tell the story that way, it's because she was just doing something innocent. She wasn't meaning to misbehave. Maybe the parents mishandled it and she's upset that way. It feels unfair. But sometimes children will actually do things that they know are wrong, and they do it for particular reasons, such as attention getting. I told the story earlier of a child, you could probably find this online somewhere, of a child who throws tantrums, and when mom ignores the tantrum and simply walks out of the room, the child notices at some point, gets up, stops tantruming, runs into the other room, and throws himself down at her feet and starts his tantrum all over again. It's pretty clear in a situation like that that what he really wants is her attention. And if she withdraws her attention, if she doesn't pay attention to the tantruming behavior, usually the tantrum itself stops, if that is the purpose of it. Now, notice that what we're saying here is not that she shouldn't give her child attention. It's more a matter of saying, if a parent notices that her child is constantly doing things in order to get attention, the parent probably needs to sit back and think, am I not giving my child enough attention overall? If they are fairly certain that they are spending the time that they need with their child, and again, children differ in terms of how much attention they actually need. If the parent's fairly certain I am giving a fair and adequate amount of attention, maybe circumstances are such that lately I've been not as able to pay the kind of attention to my children that I would want, but other than that, everything seems to be on balance pretty normal, then just don't give undue attention to behaviors that are directed specifically towards that, particularly when we're talking about misbehavior. So this child may have been not getting the attention that she actually wanted, and takes the crayons and deliberately does something she knows that she's not supposed to do, because otherwise she's going to get ignored. And if the only way, the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, if the only way that you're going to get attention from your parents is by misbehaving, that might be one of the reasons why they do it. Some children misbehave because they believe that they are significant, not in the first case because you're paying attention to me, but in the second case that I have power, and possibly I have power over you. You may have heard parents and children arguing with each other, and if you're listening in, it sort of sounds like there are no adults in the room. It's like one small child and one big child arguing over a toy. It's a struggle back and forth between the parent and the child. And here, often what's happening on the parent side is they too may believe that they are only significant when they have power, when they're able to control someone else's life, and when they're able to get somebody to do something that they've told them to do. And so the issue between the parent and the child is superficial. You can't do this or you should do that. That's really not what the fight is about. That's really not what's sustaining it. It's that both people, both the parent and the child, feel like the only way that they matter is to get the other person to do what you want them to do, to make them submit to you. And so children sometimes learn that from their parents, and they see it modeled in their parents, and they try to have power in some way because they frankly feel powerless in the relationship or feel powerless generally. And that frustrates them because they don't feel like they are enough. Sometimes children learn the idea that in order to be significant, you have to express power in a way that gets revenge on the other person. You hurt me, I will hurt you back. To that extent, at least, I feel like I have a sense of control and I have a sense of being big and I'm able to do something. So revenge might be the motivation. And I think of the last one, displaying disability or inadequacy, in some ways as another form of attention getting, because there are some children who will give up on a task and start moaning about how I can never get it right, and I can never do things, and every time I do something I get it wrong, and those kinds of things. The parent, of course, would need to step back and ask, is that the way that I actually talk to my children? Did they get that message from me? If not, it might be that they've recognized that when they talk that way, they get, again, a particular kind of attention from their parents. They get more encouragement and more messages like, no, you can do it, I believe in you, and all those kinds of things. But if they're just going on through their life and doing things, they're not getting any praise, they're not getting any encouragement with respect to things that they know that they can do well or are already doing. Might as well get that encouragement by complaining that you can't do it. So the 4 goals of misbehavior are meant to help parents sort of reflect on why a child is behaving the way that they are and what is the legitimate goal behind the misbehavior. The misbehavior is not just a matter of saying, I want to do something naughty, or I want to do something to hurt you. It's behind that is an underlying motivation that says, I'm frustrated, I'm discouraged, there's something that I need that I'm not getting, I don't feel like I belong, I don't feel significant. And in this mistaken way, in this sort of not exactly a socially appropriate way, I think I can get it. And that's where the misbehavior comes from. And so the parent has to address that. Now, if the parent is then addressing the reason behind the misbehavior, which is, again, a motivation that is legitimate in its own right to have significance, then they need to make sure that they don't engage the child in such a way that just sort of keeps the cycle going. So if a child is seeking attention and misbehaving in order to get attention, then a parent shouldn't give the attention for that. Again, the kid who throws himself on the floor and has a tantrum, if he's doing that because he wants attention, then don't give attention to it. Ignore it. Give attention to the things that you want to give attention to. Don't engage in power contests. If the child is trying to win over you, if the child is trying to hurt you, don't engage in power contests with them. Don't retaliate. That takes a certain amount of emotional intelligence on the part of the parent, because they can easily get hooked into this idea that I can't let my child win over me. What kind of an adult am I if I let a kid get the best of me? But in doing so, you continue to teach the child implicitly the lesson that the only person who really means something, the only person that's significant, is the one who has the power, is the one who is able to hurt the other person, is the one who is able to get them to do what they want them to do. When you have a child that's complaining about the fact that they can never get anything right and they always mess it up and that kind of thing, you start thinking about, okay, beyond the present situation, how can I arrange for children to discover what they can do well so that they can get a legitimate encouragement for the competencies that they actually have. And just overall, look for opportunities to encourage your children. There are so many things that can happen in a child's life that can take their courage away from them, that can leave them feeling like somehow they don't matter. If parents are intentional about making sure that they take the best advantage they can of those opportunities, the child may not need to misbehave in any of the ways that we've already described. Now, that word encouragement is particularly important to Adlerian parenting experts, and they want to contrast that with the idea of praise that we find in the behavioral approach. I think it's important to note that when they make that, that distinction between what they call encouragement and what other parents would call praise, what they are distinguishing themselves from is what they would call simple praise versus genuine praise. So in essence, it's not really a contrast. Much of what they're saying is the same as what the behavioral educators will say. It's just that they're warning against these stereotyped ways of praising in the same way that we warned against those when we were doing the lecture on behaviorism. So Adlerian parent educators are concerned about parents' overuse of praise. Every time a child does something, wow, good for you, hooray, hooray, applause, make a big deal out of it, that kind of thing, is not the same thing as a calm use of encouragement to be able to help them develop confidence in their abilities. One of the suggestions that we made in the previous lecture, if you think about, again, what Carol Dweck says about fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. If you're going to praise children, you don't want to just throw out a bunch of nice and complimentary words. What you want to do is to help them have confidence in, for example, their ability to do hard work. Anybody can do hard work, regardless of your level of intelligence, regardless of your talent in a particular area of behavior or in a particular subject area. You can work hard on that. And the more that you praise effort, the more confidence you may be able to build in your child. So again, the goal is to build a child's sense of competence, and that competence then is tied to their ability to learn, or their ability, as I've just said, to work hard, and hopefully that in learning and in working hard, they can actually affect their circumstances. Now, just like the behaviorists would say, you want to make sure that whatever encouragement you give is behavior specific. In other words, it's tied to something that they've done as opposed to generic or automatic compliments. So, example of that. Your child is taking their crayons and their markers, and instead of scribbling on the wood of the deck, they are drawing on a piece of paper just like they should. They're not making marks on the furniture and that kind of thing. And then, as often happens, the child brings the picture to mom or to dad to show it to them, to share it with them. And a lot of times when kids do that, they've got a big smile on their face. They're proud of what they've done. They show it to mom or dad. And then mom or dad says, wow, that's so pretty. Well, that's better than saying, well, you could have done this better. Or that's not what a horse looks like. A horse looks like this. Here, let me show you how to do that. Those kinds of things are very discouraging to a child. It helps them to feel like they are small and incompetent. So obviously that's not the way you want to go. But better than that's so pretty would be very specific encouragement like, I really like the colors that you chose for whatever it was, whatever part of the drawing you're looking at. I love the way you did the smile on mommy's face. Something that is very specific that they can look at and say, okay, this is what I've done well. The generic compliments don't land as well as far as being able to encourage competence and make them feel nice in the short term. They like getting compliments, but it won't encourage them in the same way as a behavior-specific compliment would be. Now, again, just like Carol Dweck says, we don't want to pay attention only to the end results, especially when it comes to things like schoolwork and so on. It's not simply a matter of getting straight A's. It's a matter of recognizing that the student is studying hard, that they are working on habits that will help them to succeed in school, that will help them to succeed in life. They are coming to you with questions, because they know that sometimes they need help. You want to encourage all of those kinds of behaviors. If they get an A out of the class, great. But pushing your kids towards an A without giving them encouragement may end up being self-defeating in the long run. You could still end up with a child who is a straight A student but doesn't believe that they're smart, that doesn't believe that they're competent in terms of their studies. Whereas you could have a child who is a B student, but they are more confident in their ability to achieve the goals that they set for themselves and to be able to do the tasks that are set before them. They're not aiming at perfection. They don't have to aim at perfection. They just are confident that they can do certain things, and they're not discouraged. Now then, beyond the four goals of misbehavior, one of the hallmarks of the Adlerian approach is the use of what they call natural and logical consequences. If you remember back to behavioralism, we talked about reward or reinforcement. We talked about punishment. Both of those are ways in which children learn. So you learn through the consequences of your behavior. If a particular behavior gains a positive consequence, a rewarding consequence, I'm going to do it more. If a particular behavior gets a negative consequence, something nice gets taken away, something negative gets visited upon me, then I learn that I shouldn't do that anymore. That's the behaviorist way of thinking. Now, the issue here is that punishment works. It gets the child to comply. It gets the child to behave in the way that the parent wants them to. The question is, what is it that they're actually learning? Learning not to hit your baby sister, for example, is a good goal. To want to make sure that your child grows up understanding that violence is not okay, that hitting somebody is not a way to solve your problem. But depending on how the parent handles that, the lesson that they may actually learn is, I can only hit my baby sister when mom and dad aren't watching. Or, I can only use violence when I get to be a grown-up and am bigger than the other person, or some such work. So punishment works. It achieves the purpose of getting behavior change, but they may not be learning what you actually want them to learn. If their intrinsic needs for belonging and significance and so forth are ignored, then something is missing in their experience. They're going to feel cheated, if you will. Something feels unfair to them, and punishment then may trigger the child's desire for revenge because they feel like they're not being treated fairly. They're not getting what they need. Whether they can articulate it or not, they know that something is going wrong, right? And so the point here is that we need to help children learn through consequences, which is an important thing. Consequences are good teachers of what the social order is all about, but we have to do that in a way that stays out of power struggles. Now, if you're a behaviorally oriented parent educator, you would say, well, of course, you need to make sure that you have either the kinds of rewards or the punishments that need to be put in place. But the way that you do that, and they will tell parents this, is you have to make sure that you do it calmly. You have to make sure that you do it in a very matter-of-fact, business-like fashion. You do not punish children in anger. You like the timeout, and when we were talking about the timeout, when you put a child in a timeout, it's because you've made an agreement as to what kinds of behaviors would get a child into timeout, and when that behavior occurs, say, well, okay, so here it is. You have to go into the chair now. That's what we agreed. And the child may complain and the child may fight back, but the parent has to control themselves and to try to remain calm as possible. So they would agree with the Adlerians here in terms of saying that children are going to learn through consequences. The parents need to stay out of power struggles. But the Adlerians take it a step further and make this distinction between natural and logical consequences. Now, what are these? Natural consequences are consequences that follow directly from behavior without the parent having to do anything. If a child touches a hot stove, they're going to get burned. And that's a lesson that nature will teach the child. That's what makes it a natural consequence. If you play with matches, you might get burned. There are all kinds of different natural consequences in the environment. The parent doesn't have to say, okay, you're going to touch that hot stove, that's gonna hurt you. Let me teach you even more by touching you with something else hot. Of course they're not going to do that, right? The stove teaches its own lesson. And the child learns to respect the natural order. They don't feel like they need to get back at the stove. They don't resent the burner. They don't resent the match for burning them, that kind of thing. They just learn this is the way things are, and I need to adjust my behavior accordingly. So you can think of a number of different situations in which, if parents didn't intervene, children would experience natural consequences. So for example, think about it, okay? I'm going to give you a few seconds after I read each one to think about it on your own, and I encourage you to do this. What negative consequences follow if parents don't intervene? Okay? Imagine you've got a kid who gets mad and in a fit of temper takes some of his toys and actually breaks them. Okay? What's the negative consequence that will happen if the parent doesn't intervene and just lets it happen? Well, possibly one natural and inevitable consequence of that is you don't have that toy to play with anymore. Your toy is now broken. If you wanted that toy, well, gee, I'm sorry, you broke that, didn't you, right? If kids crumple their dirty clothes in the corner of the room, what's the natural consequence that may come along with that? Okay, now this is going to vary from child to child, but it may be that you don't have those clothes to wear because they're all crumpled up, they're stained, they're dirty, and you don't want to appear out in public that way. Now, some kids, they wouldn't care one way or the other. It's the parent that would have to suffer the consequences if the child actually dressed that way out in public. But that's another example of a consequence that could happen if the parent doesn't do anything. If the kids leave their bikes and skateboards out and it rains, what's the natural consequence that goes along with that? Think about it. Okay, so depending on what the skateboard is made out of, it might get ruined. If you're talking about a bike, the bike could get rusty. It's going to need to be cleaned, and so on, right? So the parent doesn't have to be the one. Now, you can imagine this: the parent who comes in and gripes and moans about the kids leaving their bike out in the rain, and now it's got to be re-oiled and all of that. And yeah, well, you can't do it. I have to do it. I always have to pick up after you. That kind of thing. The child learns nothing. The parent can gripe and moan all they want. But if the child is the one who has to do all the work to restore the bicycle, it's much more likely that they will never leave that bike out in the rain again. If the parents do the job for them, what does the child learn? Well, I don't have to be responsible because my parents will do it for me. Now here then becomes a question of whether or not parents should intervene in certain situations. And here we've got the two sides to look at. There are what are known as helicopter parents. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. It's been around for a while. And these are parents who are working really, really hard to make sure that children never experience any negative consequences to their behavior or in their environment. They're always running interference for them and taking care of stuff. My brother-in-law used to work at a university in their IT department, and the university supplied laptops to all of the students, and he got a phone call from an angry father one afternoon, and the father was chewing him out and chewing out the IT department. Why isn't my daughter's laptop fixed? And how is she supposed to do her studies if her laptop isn't working? And again, mind you, this is a university-issued laptop as well. And my brother-in-law just asked him calmly the question, well, I don't see an order for that. Has she brought the laptop to us? Well, no. As he thinks like, so sir, how are we supposed to help her with that if we don't know that there's a problem with the laptop in the first place? That's an example, and sort of an extreme example, of a helicopter parent who doesn't seem to think that their children need to take responsibility for their own behavior. And if the parents keep getting in the way, then the children will not learn the responsibility they need to learn. The extreme case of that are the bulldozers who go through and are literally are mowing down other people and complaining and threatening lawsuits and all that kind of stuff if their children aren't helped the way that the parents think they ought to be helped. Now, on the other side of things, as far as allowing consequences to happen, some consequences are dangerous. And you don't want to say, well, my child will not run out into the street if once I let them do that and they get hit by a car. They're never going to do that again. Well, that's a natural consequence. It's not a natural consequence that you want your child to have. So you safety-proof things in the house, right? You tell them to not climb the furniture, but if they climb the furniture and they fall off and they hurt themselves, well, then hopefully they learn from that they shouldn't climb the furniture. But you don't make it dangerous for them. You take the necessary precautions. You don't leave a pot of water boiling on the stove with the handle sticking out and those kinds of things. Sure, they'll learn never to do that again if they pull that pot of boiling water down on top of them. But you need to take the responsibility to make the environment as safe as possible. Beyond that, you let them learn some natural consequences. The other thing is that there are some consequences that you might impose that kids just really don't care about. Or I should say some natural consequences that kids don't care about. So again, leaving the clothes crumpled in the corner of the room with a peanut butter and jelly stain on it. You as the parent might not want them to go out in public like that, but the kid might be perfectly happy to put on their favorite shirt that's dirty and covered with all kinds of stuff. So there are some natural consequences that aren't really consequences as far as the child is concerned, and the parent may have to do something else in order to get the child to comply with whatever the responsibility is. So this is where an Adlerian parent educator would teach parents to impose logical consequences instead of natural consequences. Logical consequences aren't natural in as much as if the parent doesn't do anything, a logical consequence is not going to occur. Only a natural consequence will occur. So it's something that requires planning, and it's something that requires intervention on a parent's part. And just like learning from a natural consequence gives you respect for the physical order. If I touch a hot stove, I'm going to get burned. If I leave my bike out in the rain long enough, it's going to rust. I will learn from those things. It gives you respect for the physical order. Logical consequences, the point of that is that they would learn respect for the social order. So the logic of it, excuse me, the idea is that the child would learn in a similar way that they would with natural consequences, except with consequences that the parent imposes but seem absolutely reasonable to the child as they begin to learn how the world actually works, how the social order actually works. If it seems reasonable to the child in that way, they are less likely to rebel against the consequence. And those consequences have to be delivered in a way in which you're not yelling at the child or angry, because they're going to be reacting to the negative emotion if that's the way that you do it. So, question, how then do we understand what a logical consequence should be? What are the characteristics of that? Well, I've mentioned Jane Nelson before, who has a program she calls Positive Discipline, and she has a nice way of summarizing the characteristics of a good logical consequence. She calls it the 3 R's. So the 3 R's are related, respectful, and reasonable. Related is her way of describing why a logical consequence is logical. There's a meaningful connection between the behavior and the parent-managed consequence, right? So if, for example, the child leaves the bike out in the rain and the bike rusts, that would be a natural consequence, and the child will learn from that. But if the child leaves the bike out in the rain and the parent says, well, we're going to have to take the bike away for a while because you know how we've talked about you needing to be responsible for it, and if you're not going to be responsible for it, we're going to take it back for a while until you can demonstrate that you're responsible with your other possessions and so forth. There's a connection between those things. There is no connection if the parent says, well, you left your bike out in the rain, so now you don't get to play video games for a week. Those two things aren't connected. There's no logical connection between them, right? The first one is more likely to give the child a sense that says, well, okay, this is how the social order works. This is how things are. If I'm not responsible with things, I don't get the privilege of being able to use them. The same thing's going to happen later on if the child asks to borrow the keys to the family car and gets in a wreck. You know, it makes sense to say, I'm not going to give you the keys to the car for a while. But if the kid gets the car in a wreck and then you say, again, no video games or some other such thing, or I'm going to cut off your allowance or some such thing, that doesn't make sense. And the more likely reaction that the child will have or the teenager will have is, my parents are mean. And if their sense is that the parents are mean and they're just doing that out of meanness, you're more likely to get a revenge motivation or get into a power struggle or some such thing. The child is not going to learn what you want them to learn. So the consequence needs to be related. Second, it needs to be delivered in a respectful manner. This is, again, how you teach that it is part of the social order. Look, kid, this is just the way things are, should be the attitude. Not, you're so irresponsible, or I can never trust you with anything, or you never do what I tell you to do, therefore this consequence. Criticism, humiliation is, again, more likely to make the child feel inferior, small, activate their desire for revenge, for power, all those kinds of things. So don't do that. Be respectful, be neutral, be under good emotional control when you deliver the consequence. And thirdly, it needs to be reasonable. In other words, in proportion to the behavior. If a child borrows the family car and gets a dent in the fender, you might say, okay, so you don't get the car keys for a week, or you need to do some extra work around the house in order to pay to get that fixed. Something that makes sense with respect to that. Certainly, if you had dented the neighbor's car, it would be reasonable to expect that the child, the teenager, would do something to pay back, to pay for the repair of the car. So that's how the social order works, right? That is a reasonable and related consequence. So that's what makes it a good logical consequence. It would not be reasonable to say, even if it is related, it would not be reasonable to say, you dented the fender, I'm never going to let you drive again. There's a connection there. There's a logical connection, but that's out of proportion to the behavior. Now, if the child continues to be irresponsible with the car, taking it out when you've told them they can't, or driving recklessly or some such thing, then it becomes reasonable to suspend driving privileges for longer or altogether. That would make good logical sense and would be good logical consequence. So it takes a little bit of creativity sometimes for parents to come up with a logical consequence, particularly if their bent is towards punishment. So thinking about how punishment usually doesn't succeed in doing anything more than getting compliance from the child in and of itself, gets them to behave in ways that you want them to, but doesn't teach them the underlying lesson, parents are going to need to be a little more thoughtful and sometimes a little more creative to come up with a good logical consequence for a behavior. Now again, it's not just the what of the consequence, what you decide the consequence is going to be, but the how of the consequence, the how in terms of the way that it's actually delivered. the best case scenario, the consequence should be agreed upon. The child may be a little bit resistant to it, but here you're trying to get them to agree with the principle behind it and make sure that they understand that. Again, you need to be calm, you need to be matter of fact when you're delivering the consequence, and your attitude towards the child is, I know that you get this. I'm confident that you can understand this, and I know that you can learn this. Not, well, here's my last resort because you're never going to learn this anyway, but I might as well do this because I need to punish you. But rather, I really want you to learn this lesson. That has to be the parent's attitude as they do it. And if the parent does take that attitude, if they remember to do that, they're probably more likely to be able to come up with a good logical consequence to begin with. Okay, so let's think of some possible examples. And again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it before I say what a possible response might actually be. First example. And this is one that comes from our own household, unfortunately, because when our kids were young, for whatever reason, my wife wanted to have a white carpet in the house. My daughter, I think, once said to her, "You love the carpet more than you love us," because she was always trying to make sure that they didn't get stains on the carpet, or they were careful around the carpet because, if you spill grape juice on that, that's a big pain. Okay. So let's say the child has been told no grape juice in the living room, no grape juice on the white carpet, and the child disobeys and accidentally gets grape juice on the carpet. What should the consequence be? Think about it. Okay, well, hopefully you came up with an idea, something on the order of the child should clean up the stain or help to clean up the stain. Or if it's something that requires professional means, maybe you're going to have to withhold enough allowance to be able to pay at least a portion of the cleaning fee or some such thing. All of that makes good logical sense. It needs to be done in a reasonable fashion and a respectful fashion and that kind of thing. You don't want to get out of proportion and say, I'm never going to let you drink grape juice again, because it's not a matter of the grape juice. It's a matter of having grape juice on the white carpet. And it's not unconnected, like, again, no videos or I'm going to spank you for getting grape juice on the carpet. That's not going to teach them the lessons you want to teach them. Okay. Second example, child draws on the wall with a crayon. And this is something that happened in our household as well. My daughter, being the clever and intelligent person that she was, when she realized that she was doing something she wasn't supposed to do, she wrote on the wall, "I love you, Mommy," with crayon. And you better believe that when my wife saw that, all she could do was laugh instead of getting mad. So that was pretty smart on her part. So what would a good logical consequence be for that? The child draws on the wall with a crayon. Think about it. Okay, so similar to spilling the grape juice on the carpet, one possible logical consequence for that would be, walls are not for drawing on with crayons. If you draw on the wall, we need to clean that up. Since you're the one that drew it, you need to clean it. Right? It would be connected to say, I'm going to take your crayons away, but that probably wouldn't teach the lesson quite as well as having them actually help to clean that up. Third example, a child refuses to eat vegetables. Okay, what would a logical consequence for that be? One possibility, and this is what a lot of parents actually do, is to say, well, in order to have the privilege of eating dessert, we need to make sure that we've eaten a healthy meal, because we know that dessert isn't the best thing for us. It's a treat. We don't get to have a treat until we take the responsibility of eating what we're supposed to. So no dessert, not no dessert forever, not no dessert for the rest of the week, but no dessert tonight, because tonight you didn't eat your vegetables. Now, side comment on this. Children differ in terms of how strong a reaction they may have to certain kinds of foods. So recognize the fact that you need to be a little flexible with the vegetable thing in terms of finding other substitutes that would give them the same nutritional value, the same nutritional benefit, without saying, by golly, you are going to eat those overcooked Brussels sprouts whether you like them or not. Well, what are some other things that you might be able to give them that, again, won't necessarily create a fight that's not necessary? You might have one child that's perfectly happy eating Brussels sprouts. I particularly love Brussels sprouts if they're done correctly. But you might have another child where literally they really and truly are not kidding you. They are gagging on it. And you need to do something other than torture them. Another possible idea, and some nutritionists have suggested this, is there are finicky eaters who don't want to eat particular things, but if you can find ways of hiding the vegetables in the food, particularly when they're young, what will happen is if those vegetables actually have a nutritional value that their body needs, and that's the only way that they're getting them, their body will actually tell them you need this, and over time they will develop a taste for it. So sometimes you sneak it into the food and then you introduce it slowly, a little bit at a time, and let their body tell them this is something good for you and to create its own kind of desire, rather than trying to cram it down their throats. Because I can guarantee you, if you take something that a child doesn't like to eat and you force them to eat that over and over and over again, when they grow up, they aren't going to touch it. They're going to hate it. Okay. One more piece of what Adlerians will do is conducting regular family meetings. And here's where you see the democratic value come out particularly strongly. The purpose of a regular family meeting, and this is where the whole family gets together, sit down around a table, they sit down in the living room. The purpose of that meeting is to create a reliable space for that sense of belonging. We are a family. We're all here together. This is for us. And to use that time and that space for democratically organized planning and problem solving. There are a number of different purposes that family meetings can be for. It could be for checking in with one another and making sure that there's time for people to reconnect and to talk. It can be for making family decisions. It could be for deciding where you're going to go on vacation, or whether or not we need a new policy about something as a family, and so on. But the idea here is to make it democratic. Now here's the big question. Do children have a voice in family decisions, and should children have a voice in family decisions? And again, this varies quite a bit from culture to culture, and this is where Rudolf Dreikurs, who was an early Adlerian theorist who made this idea popular, insisted that what was missing in the way that parents related to their children in America in particular is that America is a democratic country, but parents weren't running their households like democracies. They tended to be more autocratic. What the parent says goes. Now, there are cultures in which the person in power is expected to make the decisions, and it isn't a vote, and it isn't a democracy. So we need to take this with a grain of salt. What Dreikurs was saying is American parents are out of step with the culture at large to the extent that they don't have a democracy, and so maybe what they need to do is to create a democratic environment. Now, sometimes there are families, the way the old joke goes is, so here's a dad who says that we're going to have a democracy in our household. Whenever we make a decision, we're going to take a vote, okay? And there's 4 people in the family, and dad gets 5 votes. Okay, do the math from there. You know, mom gets 2 votes. Each of the kids gets 1 vote. Well, okay, so voting is not what makes the difference in and of itself. It's whether or not you truly create an atmosphere of everybody's say is important. Now, this is where, especially if you're talking about being from a cultural background in which that's an entirely foreign idea, that at the very least it's worth considering, even if the parents make the majority of the decisions. Are there decisions in which children can participate? Like where we're going to go on vacation. Is that something that needs to be solely a parental decision? Can you get input from the kids in terms of what they would like to do and so on? So ask the question as to whether or not that actually is possible, because in order to help the child grow up to learn to be able to have those kinds of conversations, to be good decision makers, you got to give them some practice in a safe environment to be able to do that. So ideally speaking then, the family meeting should be a place where the family can come to shared agreements about areas of family life that the parents are willing to say that this is a reasonable place for us to exercise a little democracy. And that might be agreements about responsibilities. It might be agreements about logical consequences. But sometimes it's just a matter of being able to sit down and connect with one another. Do we have a time every week where we can rely upon the fact that when we come here, we can talk about, here's how my week went, this is what I liked about it, this is what I didn't like about it, where parents know that they have an opportunity to hear from their kids. And kids have an opportunity to hear sometimes some things from their parents other than just scolding or discipline or some such thing. I had a colleague once who every night around the dinner table did what they called, and this is from a particular spiritual orientation, but to talk about their desolation and consolation. What was the best thing about the day? What was the worst thing about the day? And they got to hear some things from their kids that they otherwise wouldn't have heard. But you just go around the table and everybody say that, and sometimes what one person will say isn't terribly significant because they had a fairly ordinary day, but it's a way of creating that sense of belonging. This is something that marks us out as a family. So even if you aren't using it to make agreements about important things like family policies and what's an important consequence, it can be a way of connecting. So finally, general guidelines for having a family meeting. There should be, if you're going to do this to the full extent that the Adlerians would have you do that, there should be rotating roles. So it's not that the parents are always the chair of the meeting. Sometimes the kids may chair the meeting. You need to start with the parents chairing the meeting, but once that becomes a routine and the children understand what that is, then they need to be given a turn when they're old enough to be chair of the family meeting. There should be a secretary if you're going to be making decisions about things, so that somebody is actually writing down what agreements were actually made, because you may need to come back to that at some point. Well, here's the agreement that we made, and we're going to stick with that. If we're going to change it, we can certainly do that, but let's do that at another family meeting. Not because you pressured me to change it, but because we agreed together that we were going to do that. It should not be a meeting in which everybody is speaking at once, but the floor, or the right to speak and to give your opinion and your input, is something that is given by the chair. Others, when one person is speaking, other people are to practice listening. So this is a good opportunity to practice whatever communication skills have been taught, and certainly within Adlerian theory, as within pretty much every parent education and many marriage education programs, they will teach you some kind of skill with respect to speaking and listening, and during a family meeting is a good opportunity to be able to practice that. So when somebody else has the floor, when somebody else is talking, your job is to listen, not to rebut, not to answer back, not to argue. You should make it a practice that if you're trying to decide something, that you should reach agreement on one topic before you raise a new one. Sometimes what will happen in a meeting is a certain conversation will begin to get a little bit sidetracked. You came to discuss one particular thing, and then somebody says, well, yeah, but what about, and then brings up something that isn't entirely unrelated, but will sidetrack you from being able to make a decision about what you have in front of you. Now, hopefully the chair is keeping track of that, if especially if it's one of the adults, and a child can help learn that as well. But there are things that like in some organizational meetings, we call it a parking lot. Well, okay, that's a legitimate issue. That's something that we need to talk about. Let's write it on a piece of paper and put it in a parking lot. We'll come back to that at another point. Right now, there's still something that we're trying to decide, okay? If you can reach a consensus, that would be the best outcome. You should only vote if you can't come to a consensus, because votes tend to be divisive. It tends to create that sense of there being a loser and a winner, and that's not something that you actually want. So if you can't reach a consensus and it's important enough, then vote, but try to get the consensus instead. And keep minutes. This is what the secretary is for. Keep track of any important decisions that have been made. If you want to go the full 9 yards, you can read the minutes at the beginning of the next meeting. Now, none of this is meant to be an airtight, legalistic kind of thing where you always have to do things this way, as long as you recognize the wisdom of each of those suggestions and incorporate the wisdom that you need. That you don't always have the same person in charge, that you keep a written record of the important things that you want to remember, that people should listen when somebody else is talking. All those things are good things to practice. So each family needs to decide on their own where they're going to allow some flexibility in that, so that the family meeting becomes personalized for them, that it works for them the way that they want it to work. And again, the goal is that in that family meeting, everybody should have that sense of belonging. And hopefully by being part of that family and having a voice in that meeting, you also have a sense of significance. Now, again, as I mentioned briefly, but just to close the circle on this, remember Baumrinn's model where she talked about authoritarian parents, where she talked about permissive parents. What Adlerians are advocating here in that embodiment of democratic principles fits very well with what Baumrinn talked about in terms of the authoritative style of parenting, right? The Adlerians call the authoritarian style of parenting an autocratic form of leadership. They call the permissive style of parenting a laissez-faire style of leadership. They advocate for the more democratic way of doing things, and this, again, fits with what Baumrinn says is the best way that the evidence has demonstrated to raise your children, that high control and high warmth. Okay, so what we need to do then in the next lecture is I'm going to begin with a comparison of the three theories that we've looked at, because as I've said before, the different metaphors give a different sense of what each theory assumes in terms of an underlying picture of what a parent's role with respect to a child is going to be. And I think it's important for us to understand those when we're using those concepts. Once we've had that comparison, then we'll go and look at Bowen theory before we get into attachment starting in a future lecture. So Bowen will be the last piece that we do as far as the theories before we come to temperament and attachment.